Have you ever wondered how banks treat people based on their appearance? Do they really serve everyone equally, or do they judge customers before even listening to them? Today, we're diving into a shocking social experiment, one that no one saw coming. Imagine walking into a bank, dressed in worn out clothes, looking like you have nothing. How would they treat you? Now imagine if that person was actually one of the richest men in the world, Mark Zuckerberg. Yes, the billionaire behind Facebook, a man worth over $100 billion, decided to test how banks treat the homeless and less fortunate. Would they help him? Would they turn him away? Or would they recognize who he really was? What he discovered was unbelievable. And by the end of this experiment, one bank's reaction will completely shock you. Stay tuned, because this story might just change the way you see banks forever. Mark Zuckerberg had always been curious about how people were treated based on their appearance. He had heard stories of homeless people being ignored, of banks refusing to help those who didn't look wealthy. But were these stories really true? He wanted to find out for himself. One day, he came up with an idea, a social experiment. He would disguise himself as a homeless man and walk into different banks to see how they treated him. Would they offer him the same services as any other customer? Or would they turn him away because of the way he looked? To prepare, he went all in. He put on an old hoodie, some ripped jeans, and scuffed up sneakers. He even let his beard grow out a little and messed up his hair. Instead of his usual expensive watch, he wore a simple, cheap one. He looked nothing like the billionaire CEO of Facebook. He looked like a man who had nothing. To make the experiment even more realistic, Mark withdrew a small amount of cash and took an old, nearly empty bank account with him. His plan was simple: walk into different banks, ask to open an account, maybe even ask about investment options, and see what happens. Would they treat him fairly, or would they judge him based on his appearance? With everything set, Mark took a deep breath, put his hoodie over his head, and stepped out onto the busy streets. His experiment was about to begin. Mark walked through the city streets, blending in with the crowd. He wasn't the billionaire tech giant today. He was just another man trying to open a bank account. His hoodie was pulled over his head, his jeans were slightly ripped, and his shoes looked old and worn out. As he approached the doors of the first bank, he took a deep breath. This was a high-end, well-known bank, one that catered to wealthy clients and big businesses. Would they help him? The moment he stepped inside, he could feel the stares. The receptionist, a well-dressed woman, glanced at him and quickly looked away, pretending to be busy. Other customers in suits and business attire barely noticed him. Mark walked up to the front desk and spoke in a calm, polite voice. "Excuse me, I'd like to open a bank account." The receptionist barely looked up. She glanced at his clothes, then sighed. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked in a bored tone. "No, but I just need some information on opening a basic account," Mark replied. She hesitated, then pointed toward a seating area. "Wait over there. Someone will be with you shortly." Mark sat down. He waited and waited. He watched as other customers, people dressed in suits, people who looked wealthy, were helped immediately. Meanwhile, he sat there, ignored. Finally, after nearly 30 minutes, a banker walked over. He barely smiled. "What can I help you with?" the man asked, looking down at Mark. "I'd like to open a checking account," Mark said. The banker's expression changed. "We have certain requirements. Do you have a job? A minimum deposit?" "I have some cash," Mark answered, pulling out a few bills. The banker frowned. "We usually require a higher balance to start an account. Maybe you'd be better off at a different bank." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying I can't open an account?" The banker hesitated. "I'm just saying, our services might not be the best fit for you." Mark thanked him and left. The answer was clear. The bank had judged him, not based on his request, but based on his appearance. But the experiment wasn't over yet. He was just getting started. Mark pulled up his hood again and walked toward his next destination. Would the next bank be any different? After his disappointing experience at the first bank, Mark kept walking. He had been judged and dismissed, not because of his request, but because of his appearance. But maybe not all banks were like this. His next stop was a smaller local bank. These banks were known for being more customer-friendly, especially for regular working people. Would they treat him any better? Mark walked through the glass doors and approached the front desk. A young teller gave him a polite but hesitant smile. "Hi, welcome. How can I help you today?" she asked. "I'd like to open a checking account," Mark said, keeping his voice calm. The teller nodded. "Of course. Do you have any form of ID?" Mark handed over his ID. The teller glanced at it and then looked at his clothes. She hesitated for a moment but said nothing. "I'll call a banker to help you," she said. A few minutes later, a manager came out. He was middle-aged, wearing a sharp suit. His expression was neutral, but Mark could tell he was analyzing him, sizing him up. "Sir, we can certainly help you open an account," the manager said, but his tone was more formal, distant. "However, we do have certain requirements. Do you have proof of income or an employer?" Mark shook his head. "I just want a simple account. I have some money to deposit." The manager's face remained unreadable. "We typically require customers to have a stable income or a home address. Do you have a lease or utility bill?" Mark frowned. "What if I don't have one? What if I just want to start fresh?" The manager hesitated. "In that case, we could open a basic savings account, but there would be limitations." He went on to explain that without proof of income, the account would have restrictions, no checks, no overdraft protection, no credit options. "So I can open an account, but with barely any benefits?" Mark asked. The manager nodded. "That's our policy." Mark appreciated that they at least considered his request, but he could feel the hesitation. It was clear that, in their eyes, he wasn't a valuable customer. As he left, he thought about what had happened. This bank wasn't as dismissive as the first one, but it was still reluctant to help someone they assumed was poor. Would the next bank be different? Mark pulled up his hood again and kept walking. There was one more bank left in his experiment, and he had no idea that this one would shock him the most. Mark had already experienced two very different reactions. The first bank had completely dismissed him, treating him like he didn't belong. The second bank had offered limited help, but only with restrictions. Now, he was heading to a small, community-focused credit union. These types of institutions were known for helping everyday people. But would they really treat him differently? As he stepped inside, he immediately noticed a difference. The bank was smaller, but it had a welcoming atmosphere. There were no fancy decorations, no executives in expensive suits walking around. Instead, the tellers looked relaxed, chatting with customers. Mark walked up to the front desk. A middle-aged woman smiled at him warmly. "Good afternoon. How can I help you today?" she asked. Mark was surprised by her friendly tone. "I'd like to open a checking account," he said. "Absolutely," she replied without hesitation. "Do you have an ID with you?" Mark handed over his ID, expecting the same judgmental looks he had gotten at the other banks. But the woman didn't even flinch. "Great. Do you have any initial deposit?" she asked. Mark pulled out some cash. "Not a lot, but I'd like to start small." The teller smiled. "That's totally fine. We have an account with no minimum balance. And if you ever need financial guidance, we offer free workshops on saving and investing." Mark raised an eyebrow. No questions about a job? No comments about his clothes? No hesitation? Still testing the system, he asked, "What if I don't have a steady job right now? Would that be a problem?" The teller shook her head. "Not at all. We believe everyone deserves access to banking, no matter their situation. We also have resources to help if you need financial assistance." Mark was stunned. This was the first place that treated him like a human being rather than just judging his appearance. The manager even came over, smiling. "We believe in helping all customers, whether they have $10 million, he said. For the first time during his experiment, Mark felt respected.
He finished opening the account and thanked the employees for their kindness. They had no idea who he really was. As he stepped outside, he took a deep breath. This bank had passed the test. But now, it was time for the big reveal. The next day, Mark Zuckerberg walked into the first two banks again, but this time, he looked completely different. He was clean-shaven, dressed in a sharp suit, wearing an expensive watch. He no longer looked like a struggling man. He looked like exactly who he was, a billionaire. As soon as he stepped into the first bank, the one that had ignored him, everything changed. The same receptionist who had barely looked at him yesterday now greeted him with a bright smile. "Good afternoon, sir. How can we assist you today?" she said in an enthusiastic voice. Mark kept his expression neutral. "I'm interested in opening an account. I'd also like to discuss investment options." Immediately, he was ushered into a private office. The same banker who had dismissed him before was now eager to help, explaining all the exclusive services they offered. Mark listened, nodding occasionally. Then he asked, "Tell me, do you help people who might not have a lot of money? Maybe someone struggling to get back on their feet?" The banker hesitated. "Well, we have certain requirements, of course." Mark smirked. "Interesting. Yesterday, when I walked in dressed differently, I was told that this bank wasn't the right place for me." The banker's face turned pale. "Excuse me?" Mark leaned forward. "You see, I was here yesterday. But I didn't look like this. And you didn't want to help me then." The banker's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Mark stood up. "Thanks for your time, but I think I'll take my business elsewhere." At the second bank, the one that had hesitated to help him, Mark received a friendlier response than the first time. The manager, who had been cautious before, now treated him with respect. "We'd love to help you open an account, Mr. Zuckerberg," he said with a smile. "We can even offer you our premium services." Mark nodded. "I appreciate that. But I was here yesterday in different clothes, and the reaction wasn't quite the same." The manager looked uncomfortable. "I understand banks have policies," Mark continued, "but the way people are treated shouldn't depend on how much money they appear to have." The manager didn't have much to say. He knew Mark was right. Finally, Mark returned to the third bank, the small credit union that had treated him with kindness. The same teller who had helped him the day before greeted him with the same warm smile. "Welcome back. How's your day going?" she asked. Mark smiled. "Much better, actually. And I have something to tell you." He pulled down his hood, revealing himself completely. "My name is Mark Zuckerberg." The teller's eyes widened. "Wait. The Mark Zuckerberg?" The manager came over, looking stunned. "You mean, you're the billionaire?" Mark nodded. "I did a little experiment. I wanted to see how banks treat people based on their appearance. And out of all the places I visited, this was the only one that treated me with respect, before knowing who I was." The staff exchanged surprised looks. Mark smiled. "Because of that, I'd like to make a donation to support the programs you offer for struggling customers. And I'll be keeping my account here." The employees were shocked and overjoyed. Unlike the other banks, they had passed the test. Mark shared his experience publicly, and the story went viral. People were outraged at how banks treated those who looked poor, while also praising the credit union that helped him without hesitation. The experiment proved something powerful: many businesses don't treat people based on who they are, but based on what they assume about them. Mark's experience was a reminder that respect shouldn't depend on appearances, and that sometimes, the places you least expect are the ones that truly care. So the next time you walk into a bank, a store, or anywhere else, ask yourself, are they treating me fairly? Or are they just judging the way I look?